Good day and welcome to another edition of Q&A Social Security Disability Today. I am your host, Attorney Anthony Reeves, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you here. Of course, as you know, you can always leave me questions, comments, or concerns here, or if you feel free to do so, you can shoot me an email at anthony@reevesfirm.com, or you can always go to my Facebook page, which is, of course, facebook.com/Reeves Law Firm. Post comments of things you want me to talk about. Be more than happy to do so. Don't forget, sign up for my or get a subscription to my Legal Beat blog because I tend to provide different responses to different questions on that than I do here. So that's a great place for valuable information. Just want to make sure you guys all know that there are all these different assets to kind of keep you in the loop, and probably the best place to start is www.reevesfirm.com, dedicated to representing the disabled and the discriminated. All right, let's get down to our questions for today. Now, question I have is, what if a representative payee signs you up against your own knowledge with a false diagnosis and then throwing the recipient on the streets after they get the checks? Do they investigate the recipient or the rep payee or both? Here's one thing that you need to understand. You still have to go through the Social Security disability process. So if the question really is, can somebody start a disability claim on your behalf, serving as saying the representative payee? Not really, because you still need to be able to fill out those forms, and or at least with their assistance, and more importantly, go to the various appointments and so forth. So it's not one of those things where somebody can say, I'm Joe Blow, rep payee. This person over here has a disability, and I want to sign them up in the hopes that you can get benefits on their behalf. It just doesn't work like that. Even then, if you get disability benefits and you have somebody as a representative payee and they're receiving money on your behalf, is there a recourse if they're taking advantage of your money and the recipient gets nothing? Yes, there is. In this instance, to answer your question, will they investigate the recipient? Well, in the grander scheme of things, they shouldn't have to investigate the recipient unless there's a concern about fraud. In this instance, what I always recommend is that if you have a problem with your representative payee, notify Social Security. In most of their locations, they have a list of organizations that can provide rep payee services. So if you have concerns that the person that you are dealing with may not be looking out for your financial well-being, by all means, let Social Security know. They have a duty to investigate, period. And then if they determine that the person who is the representative payee is mishandling your money or doing something fraudulent, they'll just get you a new one. And then they'll deal with that person off to the side. But you don't have to worry about somebody filing a claim on your behalf and saying, I'm your representative payee with the intent of getting your money for their benefit. Too many safeguards that Social Security has to prevent that from happening. Now, here's the next question. If a person is trying to get disability because they can't work, they have diabetes, but they deal drugs, they work on cars behind their apartment complex, is that legal? If no, how can they be reported? First of all, you already answered one part of your question. Dealing drugs is illegal, period. So that is something totally separate and apart from your Social Security case. But here's the other thing that you need to keep in mind. This question brings up the point about what we call working under the table. Sometimes what happens is when people are doing work where they're not necessarily getting a check and Social Security benefits is not being pulled, that they think that they are beating the system because they're getting money and the Social Security Administration doesn't know about it. Well, if you know someone that's in that circumstance where they're applying for disability, but you know that they're working, but they're not telling anybody that they're working, you're within your rights to let Social Security know that the individual is, quote unquote, performing work. I've had it happen where I've been representing people, and I'll get an alert from Social Security telling me there's an indication that the person is working, and the person hadn't told me, and I'll call them and say, are you working? And of course they always give me the song and the tap dance, and I'm quick to tell them, listen, if you are working, even if it's off the books, for purposes of determining whether you're disabled, that is still relevant to your case. Even, you may think this is corny, even if you're dealing drugs, that is counted. And you say, well, wait a minute, is the money counted? The money? No. Because, of course, dealing drugs is a legal activity. But the activity itself is something that Social Security would keep in mind. You would say, well, what do you mean? Well, what do you do? I've never dealt drugs, but let's kind of do this from a common sense standpoint. When you're dealing drugs, what does that mean? That means you are handling product. That means you are exchanging monies for goods. That means you're calculating and so forth, depending on what the person gives you. If you're selling them something for $100 and they give you, 150, that means you got to make change. That sounds corny if you're doing it where you're on a corner on a regular basis. That means you're on your feet up and down. Some of you are saying that's just ridiculous. Really? Well, the reality is that your activities play a part in determining whether or not you're disabled. Just like if you were, in this particular example, if you were, what did they say? I think they were saying they were working on cars. Well, they're going to want to know, well, what type of things were you doing when you were working on the cars? Are we talking about changing the oil, which means getting on your back, crawling underneath? We're talking about doing engine work where you're leaning over for hours on end. You're lifting up tools. Those are things that Social Security wants to know about in detail. But the first question is this: is it legal? No, it's not. For purposes of the drugs, it's not. And for purposes of the working off the books, when you're looking at it from that, meaning if somebody's working on something and they're getting paid cash, or they're doing work but they're not telling Social Security, that has an impact on their case because they may be committing fraud. So it's kind of hard to answer that question to say, is that legal? Well, it really depends upon the nature of the circumstances. Meaning, if somebody says, I got a bad back and I can barely stand, I can barely bend, but they're working on cars, guess what? There may be an indication of fraud there. But if somebody says that I have good days and I'm able to do work on certain days, and then they're trying to do a little work here and there, is that necessarily fraud? It just depends on the context of how they apply. So, of course, dealing drugs is a fraudulent activity. Your ultimate question is, if somebody is, because when I look at this question, my first thought is you're focusing on how they're bringing in the money. Is the fact they're bringing in the money through these different sources what makes it illegal? Well, not necessarily. The fact that they're not reporting income to Social Security means their taxes are not getting pulled out. So that's one whole totally separate issue. But in terms of their disability, the proper question is not so much is it legal, it's is this information that Social Security needs to know in order to determine whether a fraud is being committed. And the answer to that is yes. And to simply just notify Social Security via calling them up and telling them it's all you have to do, and they'll take it from there. All right, everybody. Again, my apologies if I'm going at light speed. If you need me to discuss anything I've talked to you about here, as well as on my blog, please feel free to do so. Also, I've had a number of people who've sent me messages via messaging in Facebook. I don't mind that as well as I've had a few from Twitter. For those of you, use twitter.com/legalgold. Keep the questions coming, and I will keep bringing you my responses. Again, this is Anthony Reeves, and this is another of your edition of Q&A, Social Security Disability Today.